Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a deep dive into your request to level up your mentoring skills. You sent over this awesome podcast episode
Yeah.
on mastering those professional mentoring skills. And let me tell you,
Huh?
you are in for a treat.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack some super insightful stuff.
It really is a fascinating listen.
One of the biggest things that jumped out at me was how much of mentoring is about how you say things, not just what you say. Like, apparently, the actual words are only 20%
Oh, wow.
of the impact. I can't wait to dig into that with you. But first, let's talk about the words themselves.
Absolutely. We can have the most insightful advice in the world, but if it comes across as critical or preachy, it's going to fall flat.
Yeah.
That's where this perspective pivot idea from the podcast is so powerful.
Okay, the perspective pivot, remind me what that was all about.
It's about shifting your language to focus on strengths and opportunities, rather than just weaknesses. The podcast gives this example of Sarah, a team leader who had a team member who was super fast, but made a lot of errors instead of just saying, hey, slow down.
Right.
She said, I'm really impressed with your speed. Let's brainstorm ways to combine that with some quality checks.
Right, so it's like, here's what's awesome, A and D. Here's how we make it even better.
Exactly.
That feels so much more collaborative than just pointing out flaws.
Exactly. It's about invitation, not just correction. And it actually ties into the psychology of how we receive advice. When we feel like our strengths are acknowledged, we're much more open to hearing about areas for improvement.
Makes sense. But how do you actually put that into practice consistently? It's easy to say, focus on strengths, but when you're in the moment, it's easy to fall back on this needs to be fixed.
That's where having a framework like the AAA pattern can be really helpful. Remember that one?
Oh yeah, acknowledge, align, advance.
Right.
Kind of like a step-by-step for a mentoring conversation.
Right. First, you acknowledge the mentee's perspective. Then you align with their goals. And finally, you advance the conversation by offering guidance. The podcast gives specific phrases for each stage too, which is super useful.
So thinking about your mentoring experiences, how have you seen that play out? Or maybe times you've seen someone not acknowledge the other person's view and how that backfired.
What's fascinating is that it's not even just about following a script. The AAA pattern is more of a mindset shift. It's about approaching the conversation with genuine respect for the other person's perspective, even if you don't fully agree with it.
All right, so we've got the right mindset. We're choosing our words carefully to highlight potential, but then there's that whole words are only 20% of the impact thing. That's the part I'm really curious about.
It's huge. And the podcast has some great examples. They talk about this finance director, Michael, who would give feedback. But even when he meant to be helpful, it came across as super critical.
Oh, no, we've all been there. What did he do to fix it? Did he just use nicer words?
It was more than that. He discovered this thing called the power pause. Basically, after asking a question, he'd consciously leave a moment of silence.
Okay.
Instead of making suggestions right away, he'd let the mentee process and reflect.
Interesting. So not just what he said, but how he structured the conversation. What's the point of the pause, though? Is it just to sound more thoughtful, or is there a deeper reason?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's about giving the mentee space to think for themselves instead of feeling like they're being interrogated. That silence becomes an invitation to participate, not just receive a lecture.
All right, so that's one part of the melody of mentorship, right? The power pause. What else is going on with this delivery stuff?
The podcast breaks it down into 3 elements: pace, pitch, and power, and they use the analogy of a musical instrument, which I love.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does playing the mentoring instrument work?
Well, think about how a musician varies the pace and rhythm of a song to create different feelings, slowing down the pace at key moments in a mentoring conversation can aid retention, like after you've said something really important. And then varying the pitch can signal different intentions.
So like I'm thinking a lower pitch for serious topics, higher for exciting stuff. Is that what you mean?
You're getting, or a gentle upturn at the end of a suggestion to make it sound more inviting than commanding. It's subtle, but it makes a big difference.
This raises an important question. How do you find the right balance? Like, you don't want to be over the top with the theatrics.
Right. It's not about putting on a show. It's about being authentic and using your voice to create the right emotional atmosphere for the conversation. And just like any skill, it takes practice.
Okay, so we've got the power pause. We're playing with our pace and pitch. There's one other really interesting technique. They mentioned empathy echo, I think it was called.
Yes. This one is all about matching your tone to the emotional weight of the conversation. It's a powerful way to signal true understanding.
So like if someone is sharing a really difficult situation, you'd lower your voice,
Yeah.
almost like mirroring their seriousness.
Exactly. Or if they're excited about a breakthrough, you'd let your own enthusiasm shine through the podcast, mentioned a client who completely transformed their approach using this technique.
Yeah.
They started calling it the confidence cascade.
The confidence cascade. What an image. I'm already picturing how that would work. So
Oh.
walk me through, how does this actually play out in a real conversation?
It's about shifting your tone throughout the conversation you might start, with a strong, steady tone to establish authority as you share your expertise. But then, as you transition to sharing personal experiences, your tone might soften, making you more relatable. And when you get to brainstorming solutions together, you'd brighten your tone, creating a sense of optimism and possibility.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's like guiding the mentee through different emotional stages of the conversation just by using your voice.
Exactly. It's about using the empathy echo to build rapport and trust, and ultimately to help the mentee feel heard and understood. And that's what creates those breakthrough moments in mentoring.
Okay, we're off to a great start.
Yeah.
But this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? We've talked about the words and how we deliver them, but there's a whole other aspect of mentoring that we haven't even touched on yet.
Right, and this is a big one, the art of listening.
Stay tuned, folks, because in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore the power of listening and how it can truly transform your mentoring relationships.
It's going to be eye-opening. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're picking up our exploration of how to become a truly exceptional mentor.
And last time we left off on this cliffhanger about listening, which,
Yeah.
it seems obvious, but the podcast you sent over makes the case that most of us aren't doing it as well as we could be, especially when it comes to mentoring.
It's true. We often think of mentoring as giving advice, sharing our wisdom, but this podcast really flipped that on its head. They had this stat that blew my mind. The most successful mentors, actually, spend 70% of the conversation listening.
Whoa, 70%? Okay. I'm officially intrigued, but it can't just be about sitting there quietly, right? There's got to be more to it than that.
You're absolutely right. It's not about passive hearing. It's about what they call detective listening.
Ooh, I love that detective listening. So what are we looking for clues to their deepest secrets?
Sort of. It's about treating every word, every pause, every shift in tone as a piece of the puzzle. It's about understanding what's really going on for the mentee.
Yeah.
Not just what they're saying on the surface.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this goes beyond just, tell me more. They gave some specific techniques for this, right?
They did. One that stood out to me was the echo and elevate technique. They gave an example of Lisa, a marketing exec, who was mentoring someone struggling with self-doubt. Instead of just offering reassurance, Lisa would echo back what she heard and then elevate the conversation.
So not just, hey, it's going to be okay, but more like, I hear that you're feeling uncertain about this. Tell me about a time when your ideas did make a big impact. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Exactly. It validates the mentee's feelings while guiding them towards a more positive and productive mindset.
That's so clever. It's like, I hear your struggle, AD. Let's tap into your strengths. Kind of like that perspective pivot we were talking about before.
I hadn't thought of that connection before, but you're so right. But applied to listening, and the podcast even takes this listening thing a step further. They say it's not just about our ears, it's about engaging all of our senses.
Okay, hold on. All our senses. I'm imagining a mentoring session with aromatherapy candles and soothing music.
Not quite. They call it the triangle of understanding, using your ears, eyes, and intuition to get the full picture.
All right, I'm with you on ears and eyes. But intuition, how do you teach that?
Think about it this way. Have you ever had a conversation where someone's body language or tone didn't match their words? Like they said they were fine, but their shoulders were slumped?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That's your intuition talking.
It's like our gut feeling is picking up on something that isn't being said out loud.
Exactly. And the podcast makes a point that those unspoken cues can be just as important as the actual words one of their clients. A senior VP saw a 40% increase in team engagement just from getting better
40%
at tuning in to those subtle signals.
Okay, that's a pretty compelling case for paying attention. But this is a lot to keep track of.
Right.
Like, I'm already picturing myself in a mentoring session trying to decode every twitch and microexpression. It sounds exhausting.
I know, right? It's not about turning into a human lie detector, the podcast emphasizes that it's a skill you build over time. And it starts with simply being more present in the conversation.
That makes sense. More present, not just waiting for your turn to speak, but really trying to step into the other person's shoes. It's almost like active listening. is the foundation that all these other techniques are built on?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Active listening is the bedrock of effective mentoring. It's what allows us to use the perspective pivot, to deliver feedback with the right melody, and to ultimately create a space where the mentee feels truly seen and heard.
All right, so we're listening like detectives. What's next on this mentoring mastery journey?
This is where things get even more interesting, because once we've mastered the art of listening, we can move on to the art of questioning.
Ooh, yes. I've always thought that asking the right questions is like magic. You can unlock so much insight and potential that way.
Exactly. And the podcast has a whole section on how to craft powerful mentoring questions. It's like they're giving us the keys to the thought elevator.
Okay, I am so ready for this thought elevator ride. But before we get to that, we need to take a quick break. Stay tuned, folks, because in the next part of our deep dive, we'll be exploring the art of chibi, questioning, plus the power of storytelling, and even how to handle those dreaded difficult conversations.
Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of how to become a truly exceptional mentor, and if you're just joining us, you'll definitely want to check out the first two parts of this deep dive,
Yeah.
where we covered some powerful techniques for setting the right tone
Right.
and becoming a master listener.
It's amazing how much those foundational skills can impact your mentoring relationships.
Absolutely. And now we're going to build on that foundation with a skill that can truly unlock your mentee's potential. The art of asking powerful questions.
It's like having a key that opens up hidden doors in their thinking. The podcast you shared called it Crafting Questions That Paint Masterpieces.
Okay, I love that. So how do we become mentoring Michelangelos? What are the tools we need?
The podcast introduced this really cool concept called the question pyramid. They gave an example of James, a consulting partner, who uses it to guide his mentoring conversations.
Right, the question pyramid, walk me through this. What are the building blocks?
Think of it as having different levels, each designed to take the conversation deeper at the base.
Yeah.
You have foundation questions.
Yeah.
These are all about getting a baseline understanding of the situation. Things like, what's the goal here? Or what have you tried so far?
Okay, so those are like the groundwork. What comes next?
The next level is perspective questions. These are designed to challenge assumptions and help the mentee see things from different angles. For example, what would someone who disagrees with you say about this? Or what are the potential blind spots you might have?
Ooh, those are good. I can see how those would really get someone thinking differently.
And then at the very top of the pyramid, we have the revelation questions. These are all about sparking creative thinking and unearthing hidden insights.
Okay.
Think along the lines of, what's the most unexpected thing you've learned from this challenge?
Oh.
Or if you could do it all over again, what would you do differently?
Wow, those are powerful. I can see how those could lead to some major aha moments. But how do you know which type of question to ask and when?
That's where the art comes in. It's about listening closely to the mentee, understanding where they are in their thinking, and then choosing the questions that will help them move forward. It's like you're using those questions to build a thought elevator, as the podcast puts it.
I love that analogy. So we're starting at the ground level, understanding the basics, and then we're taking them higher and higher with each question, opening up new perspectives and possibilities.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
And remember, it's not just about the words themselves, it's about the tone, the pauses, the whole melody of mentorship we talked about earlier.
Right, we're using those techniques to create a space where the mentee feels safe to explore,
Yeah.
to challenge their own assumptions, and to ultimately come to their own solution.
Exactly. And that brings us to another powerful tool in the mentoring toolkit, storytelling.
Ah, yes, stories. They have a way of cutting through the noise and making a real impact.
The podcast mentioned a study that found stories are actually 22 times more memorable than facts alone.
Wow, 22 times, that's incredible.
Yeah.
But how do you use stories effectively in a mentoring context?
Right.
It's not like we're sitting around a campfire roasting marshmallow.
Right. It's not about telling fairy tales. It's about using stories to illustrate points, to make abstract concepts concrete, and to connect with the mentee on an emotional level. The podcast shared a story about David, a product manager who was struggling to get his team excited about innovation. Instead of just lecturing them about the importance of being innovative,
Right.
he shared a story about a time when he was a developer and turned a potential disaster into a major breakthrough.
And I bet that made all the difference, right? Hearing a real story, seeing how those abstract principles actually played out in a real life situation.
Exactly. Suddenly, innovation wasn't just some vague concept. It was something tangible, something they could relate to their own work.
So how do you find those perfect stories? Do you just keep a running list in your head? of all your successes and failures, waiting for the right moment to whip one out.
Haha. Well, it helps to have a few go-to stories that you can adapt to different situations. But the podcast actually gave this helpful framework called CRAFT to help you create powerful mentoring stories.
Okay, Crocraft T, tell me more about this framework.
It stands for Context, Relevance, Action, Feeling, Takeaway. Basically, it's a checklist to make sure your stories are engaging, impactful, and relevant to the conversation.
So you start by setting the context, making sure the mentee understands the situation.
Right. Then you highlight the relevance to their current challenge, showing them why this story matters to them. Then you describe the actions you took, the choices you made.
And then the feeling. So you're not just recounting the facts, but bringing the story to life with emotion.
Exactly. And finally, you end with the takeaway, the lesson learned, the insight gained, the wisdom you want to share.
I love it. So we're listening like detectives. We're asking powerful questions. We're weaving in these captivating stories.
Yeah.
But we're not quite done yet, are we? There's one more big piece to this mentoring puzzle.
Right. And it's a piece that a lot of people find challenging, navigating those difficult conversations.
Oh, yes, those conversations that we dread, but that are often the most important ones to have.
But here's the thing. The podcast actually shared research showing that 85% of breakthrough mentoring moments come from those difficult conversations.
85%. Okay, so maybe we need to reframe our thinking about these conversations. Not as something to avoid, but as opportunities for growth.
Exactly. They call it the tension to transformation technique.
Okay, I love that. So how do we turn those tense moments into transformative ones? They gave some specific tips for this, right?
They did. One of the most powerful techniques they shared was the psychological safety bridge. They gave the example of Marcus, a senior director, who used to dread giving constructive feedback. Instead of starting with something like, we need to talk about your performance.
Oh yeah, that's definitely going to put someone on the defensive.
Right, so instead he learned to open with something like, I'd like to explore something that I believe could significantly impact your growth.
Okay, so it's about reframing the conversation as an opportunity, not a criticism. I can see how that would make a big difference.
Exactly. It creates what they call a trust container, where difficult truths can be shared without triggering that fight or flight response.
And then once you've built that bridge, they have a whole framework for navigating those conversations, right? The clear framework.
That's right. Connect emotionally first. Lead with observations. Explore perspectives. Address concerns. And reach solutions together. One VP they worked with saw her feedback acceptance rate jump from 40% to 90% after implementing this approach.
Wow, 90%. Okay, that's pretty compelling evidence that this stuff works. But even with the best techniques, there are going to be times when things get messy, right?
Sure.
Like what if the mentee gets defensive, even if you're trying to be supportive?
Absolutely. And that's where those active listening skills we talked about earlier come back into play, remembering to echo and elevate, to really try to understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
Right, it's about creating that space where they feel heard and respected, even when the conversation is tough. But what about when we mess up? Like, what if we say something that unintentionally hurts the mentee's feelings?
Yeah, the podcast addressed that, right?
Yes, they talk about the importance of recovery techniques. It's not about being perfect. It's about owning our mistakes and showing our mentees that it's okay to be human. And they gave this great example of Kevin, a mentor who completely botched a feedback conversation. He realized he had been projecting his own
anxieties onto his mentee, and it had come out in a really unhelpful way.
That's rough. What did he do?
He used what the podcast called the authentic pivot technique. He went back to his mentee, apologized sincerely, and explained that he had been approaching the conversation from the wrong place.
Wow. I bet that took a lot of courage.
It did, but you know what? The mentee actually responded really positively. They appreciated his honesty and vulnerability, and it actually strengthened their relationship.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's like sometimes our imperfections can actually be opportunities to deepen the connection.
Exactly. And ultimately, that's what this whole mentoring thing is all about, isn't it? Building strong, trusting relationships that empower both the mentor and the mentee to grow. And that brings us to the final piece of the mentoring mastery puzzle, building trust.
Or trust. If mentoring were an Olympic sport, trust building would be the gold medal, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It's the foundation of everything else we've talked about.
So how do we become gold medal trust builders?
Well, the podcast had some really insightful points about this. They talked about the importance of the language of trust, of creating a space where the mentee feels safe, supported, and valued.
That makes sense. But how do we actually do that? Are there specific words or phrases we should be using?
They shared the story about Elena, a CFO, who transformed her mentoring approach. By using what they call the trust trilogy, instead of jumping right into advice-giving mode, she starts by building connection.
So what does that look like?
She'll use phrases like, your perspective on this is fascinating, or I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay, so it's about acknowledging their expertise, showing them that their opinions matter.
Exactly. It's about demonstrating that you're there to listen and learn, not just to lecture.
And once you've built that foundation of respect, that's when you can start sharing your own insights and advice.
Right, but even then, it's about being mindful of your language.
So instead of here's what you need to do, it's more like, let's explore this together. Or what are your thoughts on how we might approach this?
Exactly. It's about making it clear that you're there to support them, not to dictate to them.
I love it. It's so simple, but so powerful. It's about shifting the whole dynamic of the relationship from expert and novice to partners in growth.
And you know, the podcast made this really interesting point. They said that trust isn't built through grand gestures. It's built through those small, consistent actions.
Oh, yeah, the micro moments of truth, right?
Yeah.
Like remembering a detail the mentee shared, following up on something they mentioned.
Exactly.
Just showing them that you're paying attention.
Exactly. It's about being reliable, being responsive, being present in the relationship. It's about proving through your actions that you're worthy of their trust.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much ground, from setting the right tone to mastering the art of questioning to building unshakable trust.
It really has.
But even with all these techniques, there's one thing that the podcast emphasized over and over again, and that's the importance of
Practice.
exactly. And knowing these techniques is one thing, but actually using them in real life conversations is what makes all the difference.
It's like learning to play an instrument. You can read all the books and watch all the videos, but you're not going to become a musician until you actually pick up that instrument and start playing.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So what's our call to action for listeners? What's the one thing we want them to take away from this deep dive?
I think it's this: choose one technique that resonated with you and try it out in your next mentoring conversation.
Yes, don't try to do everything at once. Just pick one thing and experiment with it. See how it feels. See how the mentee responds.
And then come back and tell us about it. We'd love to hear your stories and insights.
Absolutely. This is a journey we're all on together. And by sharing our experiences and learning from each other, we can all become the exceptional mentors we aspire to be.
Well said. It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that you're passionate about. Until then, keep those mentoring conversations flowing. And remember, the best mentors are the ones who never stop learning and growing.